I'm very, very appreciative that everyone came in tonight. As you know, this is our 15th week unfortunately, our 15th week of still covering the Ukraine Russian war. And I just found one fact today that over 1 million people have died, between Russian soldiers, Ukrainian soldiers, civilians, just children. It's really a staggering number, 1 million people. Um, but it goes on, and heroic folks like Madeleine and her colleagues continue to cover this. And I know that in the mainstream media, it's dying down a little bit, the interest, and it pops up because of our leadership in our country and a number of other factors that are involved. But we're going to be doing it. We have 8 journalists this week from Monday through Thursday. And I'm thrilled to have Madeline Kelly, and we'll also have a pre-recorded presentation after Madeline, Federico Quintana, who I recorded with, who's was in Italy actually, and we recorded. But with that, Madeline, you share your screen. It's all yours. And Madeline, thank you so much. I know it's been a long journey for you coming from Sierra Leone earlier today to do this, so I appreciate that very much. It's all yours, dear.
Yeah, of course. Perfect. Is oh, everyone should be able to see.
Yeah,
Perfect.
we've
Can
got you.
everyone see?
Yep.
Perfect. So yeah, just getting started nice and easy. As I mentioned that access to the front line is getting harder. Frank and I were discussing earlier. You have to kind of start working differently than you used to with military. And now I've found that a lot of what is accessible to us is training, and a lot of what is, you know, workable is training because they feel it's a very safe environment to take journalists. It's a very safe spot, comparative. And this one, I was working directly with the 28th, who has moved their training from General ZSU training. So when you sign up to the military, you go to essentially basic for 45 days, I believe is what the limit is. And then you're sent to your unit for more specialized training. And then you're working directly with them, where the 28th Brigade has decided now, from the moment that you sign your contract, they're going to be doing all the training, including basic. So this was part of their beginning of training to show that this is going to be what they want to do. They want to make more combat ready soldiers, and they felt that the best way for them to do it is to have their people who know how they're going to be fighting, who know where they're going to be fighting, to be training their new soldiers. And this was a group of infantrymen who have been fighting outside and inside Touretsk for the past few months. And unfortunately, the soldier in the very front is currently injured at the moment. But they're still alive, so he's pretty happy about that. But they also oh, there we go. And so
Yeah,
this
Madeline, how long does this training part take for them? Any idea?
so basic is about 45 days, and I think it depends on what position you're going to be going to. So I think if you're infantry, and your unit is less specialized, the training time is shorter.
Mm,
So if you do drones, you're going to have a longer training time, and it depends on which drone as well. So reconnaissance drone is a lot shorter than the Baba Yaga drone, than the FPV drone or the fiber optic drones. And the people who drive and work with M113s or tanks also have different training. So it's really dependent, but everyone gets the bare minimum 45 days, which was raised. It was initially only 30, but then they decided that that was not nearly enough. So they
mm.
pushed it again an additional 15. Even for people who are working in headquarter jobs in Kyiv, they're going to they're going to all be required to do the minimum amount of time.
And do you see AI getting involved with the drone making?
Oh yes. Oh yes. I would say less of the drone making and more of the drone usage. So I've been talking to to people. And at the moment, they've run into this new problem. You know, a year ago, it was drones were just starting to get night vision or the ability to see at night or the ability to have thermal, which was crazy and it was changing because it went from being able to move from the front line constantly back and forth at any time of day to now having to do it at night. And then now you can't necessarily do it at night or during the day with any difference in safety. But now they've also discovered that fiber optic drones are using AI targeting systems. So they set up essentially what are ambushes. So on the road, they'll have the drone that's deployed, and it won't need a pilot at this point. The pilot will get it to where it needs to be and just have it sit and wait for a target and what it deems as a target, whether it's a vehicle or a person, the targeting system will automatically direct the drone to target that item. So now they also are having the terrifying realization that AI drones are going to become a growing threat where you don't even need a pilot on the other end of it. You just need someone to deploy the drone and then it'll do the rest itself.
Yeah. And how do you learn all this technology? Are you just picking up pieces here and there from speaking to soldiers? How does that work for you?
Yeah, so I tend to check in a lot with, I've press officers. And press officers also, they have the job of making sure like, what the media knows and everything, but finding out from, soldiers directly is one of the things, keeping contact with the people that you talk to. Like in the previous image, that gentleman who was in the front coming out of that trench with the smoke grenade, I check in with him to see like how are things going because he works directly with infantry and in Tourette, so he's able to kind of say, this is what we're facing now sooner rather than officers are willing to let us know. So you just kind of have to keep in contact with a lot of people and check up on them and see how they're doing. And also, they like the photos. So once the photos are approved by press officers, a good way to maintain relationships is to just send it to them. They
Mhm.
want to post the photos on Instagram if, they feel like they look really cool in the photo. So you can just send it to them and they get to post it on Instagram. Um, I always joke that I can send it to them for their Tinder or for their wife, whichever one works. Um, and
Okay.
it usually works. So that's usually how I'm able to like keep in contact and stay friends with a lot of soldiers.
But an important part of your job,
Yep, yep,
right?
exactly. And it's easy. You can figure out, sometimes the official channels aren't willing to admit something's happened or until it's, about a week later just because they want to control the information, which is completely understandable from a strategic, a tactical, and just on a military standpoint. Of course, they want to control the flow of information and what's happening to help give them strategic advantage, but sometimes you get to know a little bit earlier than everybody else. Um, and other times you don't. But it's one of the easier ways. Technology has really been the large determinant of this war. Even just seeing people who will step out of the trench to play their little phone games that way they can get service for 30 seconds. Um, you know, people playing on their phones as artillery's coming in is it's a very interesting juxtaposition. But yeah, so and then there's also they a lot of this training. So these are going to be infantrymen, and this was with the 24th Brigade, and there's kind of a big difference that I found between who's training on day-to-day trainings and who is being promoted for these training purposes, if that makes sense. So the previous images for the 28th, those were guys that they really wanted to be able to showcase as, they are doing their own training. This was very much them saying, journalists come out, see us get ready to start to train our own men. So they had all the cool vehicles and everything, but most day-to-day training is kind of a lot smaller and a lot simpler. So this is the 24th Brigade, and is on that man's patch, you can see it says Pijota. So these are infantrymen, and all of these men are probably above the age of 45. Some of them are in their 50s or late 50s, early 60s. But what they were doing here was trigger control and like kickback. So they were dry firing, but with the shell casing, right, as you can see, set up there. So that way, when they would fire, um, if they could hold the gun steady enough, it wouldn't fall, even if they, if they pulled the trigger. So they're working on, having them do a slow trigger pull for better accuracy and just better training. But their training days were more of, very simplistic. They go, they have targets, they shoot, and then that's it. They have lunch. So they kind of do that day to day, and they are doing more consistent training. So when you're not on the line, instead of being resting for 4 or 5 days, you are doing more training, which with the goal to keep people alive, I think is essentially what it is. Because the East has become an inevitable meat grinder. I guess you could say. There's a lot of infantry units that are just getting absolutely wiped out with how difficult the front line has become. Um,
And Madeline, with your intimacy of being with these folks, can you register guys who are really frightened? These
um,
trainees.
oh, they're all terrified.
Yeah.
Every single one of them. I mean, I would be too, and I think some of them, um, even the ones who are, 20 years old, there's some very, once, yeah, there's, sorry, give me a second. Yeah, so they're all terrified. Even the ones that are 20 years old, the ones who didn't have to sign up, who weren't mobilized, the ones who volunteered. I think, there's this growing realization the further into training that you get, how real it's going to be. And a lot of these guys are coming off the line already for further training. So they're missing their children, they're missing their families and their wives, and they're having this time that they are taking very seriously, but they are terrified. I mean, I would be too, even the younger ones with a lot of bravado and I'm the young man who's going to go and fight for my country. It is a very scary reality. I think there are a few things that unify them is the fear of drones, the fear of artillery, and the fear of, Russian Spetsnaz. So there's kind of like, the ghost stories of the Spetsnaz, um, the drones, and then artillery that are always kind of terrifying to everyone that you meet. They all say the same few things from my end, at least, that I found. But yeah, it's the training has gotten very interesting, and I think, this is another one of the ones that I mentioned where with the 28th, where they're trying to showcase their abilities, and part of that is Western weapons. Um, I think part of the fear that people are having right now, especially with the new American administration and the failure for Europe to give a clear answer on whether they're going to step up, is what is going to happen with Western weapons, what is going to happen with the flow, what is going to happen with ammunition. So I think people are heavily reliant on a lot of these vehicles, a lot of these materials, and they're terrified that once that goes away, it's going to be a lot harder for them to maintain the line. And this is another one of the images from the 28th of them showcasing that they have Humvees, which was very fun to watch them shoot. They would, go and shoot at the hill for the training, and everyone, they're strong pieces of equipment and they're armored. So, even with an FPV hit, a lot of times it saves lives. instead of just being in a soft shell vehicle, or like a civilian vehicle.
And
Um,
and how quickly do they get information? You know, like what's going on politically in the States, like what happened at the White House. I mean, does that get to them in a day, 2 days,
Instantly. They
instantly?
all have internet, they can watch it live.
They're watching it live. Wow.
Yeah,
Wow.
so there's been multiple times, when I've been sitting in a trench and we were watching the news live, and it was just kind of surreal to see what was happening. I think there was it was very similar when Prigozhin made his run to attempted run to Moscow. Everyone was watching it live, or where when Trump had
Wow.
his victory, soldiers were texting that because Trump said he was going to end the war in 24 hours. Soldiers were jokingly texting that they can't wait for their vacation on Saturday. I thought that they were going to be done, so they knew everyone knows immediately what's going on.
And
Um,
is it translated for them straight away? Or are there moments where they say, what did he mean by that, Madeline? Like, are you helping interpreting anything?
I think most of it's translated pretty immediately.
Yeah,
Because there are Ukrainian reporters and Ukrainian news outlets that are just ready to get this information out there. So it doesn't take too long. But I
right,
think implications is a lot harder to understand because honestly, I don't think the American people understand the implications of what's happening. I don't think the administration understands the implications of what's happening or the reasoning behind what's happening. So how can we expect I personally, half the time, I don't understand what's happening
right.
or why it's happening or what is the reasoning behind it all. So I think it's harder for them, for Ukraine and for anyone, not American to understand because I have no idea. I don't know how to expect them to know. I have no idea myself.
Yeah, no,
Um,
I think we're all in that bag. Yeah.
yeah. So, Zelensky came out recently. I can't remember who he was speaking with. But he's speaking with a reporter, and he's playing the very smart book, and he told Trump that Putin is afraid of him. Um, he's like, yes, I told Trump that Putin is afraid of him, and I think he's hoping that in doing so, it can drive enough of a wedge between Putin and Trump to where the continued support for Ukraine, like the support for Ukraine, will continue. Um, but we have no idea. But people here are preparing for the worst. They're preparing for Starlink to be shut down, which would completely cripple the Ukrainian military. They're working on, becoming self-sufficient, but the question is how soon can that be done, and how efficient will it be? The change has to be made. They have to move equipment. You can't just, Starlink turns off and then you flip a switch and another system turns on. You have to deploy all the cables and all the little um, satellite dishes, I guess is what they could be equated to
Yeah.
for it. So, um, yeah, everyone's just kind of waiting with bated breath here regarding a lot of what's going on in the West. And then, Europe's ability and willingness to step into the place of the United States when it needs to, and if they will. I think that's another big question on everybody's mind. Perfect.
Yep.
And then speaking of Western weapons, this was taken at an artillery firing. So this was I believe it was it was a self-propelled howitzer from, oh gosh, I cannot remember which country, but they have started to do most of their work at night now with the drones. And what that man is moving is the drone net. So, in the hopes that if a drone does come in, it gets stuck in the net. So that way, while there's an explosion, it's not deadly. And you're dealing more with shrapnel and concussions. But even the self-propelled artillery has started staying put. So this one had been in position for, so they will take a chunk of land and they'll dig a nice little hole and they'll just tuck it in and drive it backwards right in, so it kind of is hidden in there, and then they cover it up with trees and netting, and try and stay in place as long as possible because moving it around makes it a lot easier of a target. Whereas if it stays hidden, no one really knows where it is. And part of hiding that is using nets, and not having brightly colored lights. So this crew was working with, but basically Christmas lights. They had little blue ones, green ones, and red ones, but no bright kind of yellow, white lights that made it too visible for any sort of reconnaissance drone. Um,
It's amazing to have this kind of technology, and it all gets back down to netting and leaves, and
yeah,
right. I mean, like, it's two different worlds happening like right around the same time.
yeah, and it's very, like I said, it's very much watching World War II with phones and drones. It's the solutions are simple, but the problems are complicated. If you can just put a net over it, and if that drone gets stuck in the net, it doesn't hit you anymore. Um, and I think, it's kind of the same thing as when artillery was first invented. If you dig underground and dig far enough, then the explosion doesn't get you anymore. So I think but it's accelerating at a rapid rate. As I mentioned, a year ago, the way that the drones on the front line affected movement was limiting it to nighttime. So that way, you'd go out in the middle of the night at 3 a.m. And now even that doesn't matter. Um, this unit, I started with them at 2 p.m. in the middle of the afternoon, and there were too many drones, so we just kind of waited on the road, and you just kind of wait for the drones to leave the area and wait for the drone teams that are working in that area to just get tired and go to bed or to find other targets, and then you move in.
When you
So it's
say
just
too
kind of,
many drone, when you say too many drones, give us a number. Is that 10? Is that 20? Is that what is that?
I don't know. They never tell me. They
Okay.
never tell me. I say, well, like, how many drones are out there? Like, too many. And sometimes you can hear them. Like sometimes they'll tell you like there's 4 Lancets. They'll get specific with them. Sometimes they'll tell you that there's like couple of different recon drones. But I think with FPVs, I don't know how many they mean when they say too many.
Okay.
Um,
I
because
just gave I just gave you
FPVs are
homework, Manny.
easiest. I'll find out.
Okay.
I'll ask them because I'll be going back out soon, so I can ask them what exactly is too many. Because
Okay.
with infantry positions, we've sat and we've watched, and in the course of 5 minutes, like 15, 20 drones will just cross back and forth over the line, and you don't know whose is who. That's the other thing is, unless it's your specific drone, you don't know who the drone belongs to. There's no way to keep track of Russian or Ukrainian. They're just everywhere. Um, so they are, I think, objectively one of the most terrifying parts of this war is the
You just don't
drones.
know. Yeah.
And then, even in liberated areas, as I mentioned, there's another thing that kind of scares Ukrainian soldiers. And, part of it is a little bit of a ghost story, and part of it is psychological operations, but it is, these Russian Spetsnaz teams, these teams of Russians who go behind Ukrainian lines and work from behind the lines. And I was with a group and we went to Chernobyl, and part of the reason, that soldiers were insisting that they go first was because, they were worried about saboteur groups in the Chernobyl area. And, they're up working on that border. And, Ukrainians are, they're joking that they're hunting the Russians in Chernobyl, but it's 100% true. Um, the commonness of it is quite unclear. But I think that the Russian information and the Russian teams are doing a good job of spreading that fear that comes with it.
Mm.
If you're afraid that someone is going to enter your blindage and killing in the middle of the night that you don't know because they got behind the line, it's gonna keep everybody scared. And we had that experience in Chernobyl where they were very, on edge and making sure that nothing happened. And also, it's very heavily mined as well. So that adds another component to exactly how difficult movement across the line and across deoccupied areas is. Um, all of Chernobyl is heavily mined. If we're just talking from a peace standpoint, I don't know if tourism will ever really fully come back to Chernobyl in the way that we saw it. Um, it's too filled with landmines. You can't really, take a tour group and have children there because if a child runs off and accidentally finds a landmine, now you have to deal with that problem. But
Yeah.
yeah, there's a lot of different components that are affecting how this war is going and how this war will eventually end and what peace is going to look like in Ukraine, um, and how difficult it is going to be to recover from everything just on a strategic strategic and emotional point, and um, they have this graffiti artist that was Russian. No idea who it was, but they painted these bears in Chernobyl. So now the site that was um, essentially untouched for since 1986 now is filled with Russian graffiti, and you can kind of see all these little chunks of white spots. It's where they were Russians were writing things. I wasn't entirely sure what they said that they were writing, but it was very like, you know, inappropriate slurs and language on the wall. But they, for whatever reason, Ukraine decided to leave these two bears that a Russian occupier had spray painted on the wall, um, which
Mm.
is which I found was quite an interesting decision. I mean, as much as I hate to say it, it is a really good piece of graffiti art. It's a very well done bear. It's a very well done bear, and I think it's a softer reminder of Russian occupation in the area than the language that was probably written above it. So I think they made a choice there to keep it. Um, oh, oh, come on.
Yeah.
There you go. Oh, and then, we get back to what it looks like for, modern warfare. This man's just on his phone in the middle of training. Playing, they play video games. You can see them swiping on Tinder. You can just see them kind of playing all these fun little things or talking to their family. But just when he was waiting for his turn for the small, for that trigger, for that shell casing where it would trigger control training, there's, playing on their phone and having a normal good time. But this man is in his mid to late 50s, and he is going to be infantry until the end of this war, or until he's promoted, unfortunately.
It's
Um,
really a crazy experience, huh, Madeline? The normalcy and the craziness all and drones flying overhead. It has to play a real test psychologically on everybody.
yeah, I think it's going to be a large problem when this is over. I think you can already see that I believe it was the Washington Post who did a really good article about how domestic violence is already on the rise in Ukraine, and how men are coming home angry, and men are coming home honestly pissed off and with guns, and how there's increase in violent crime and increase in crime against women. And I think that Ukraine is going to have a reckoning with itself here pretty soon as well, of how do we prepare for hundreds of thousands of men who just saw, modern war in its worst form, and it's, one of the worst wars that I think humankind has seen so far. how are we going to deal with this, and how are we going to deal with people coming home from this? And I think if Ukraine doesn't start taking steps pretty soon to deal with this, I think in Sierra Leone they had these combatant camps that helped them,
Mm.
after the war. Instead of going home, they went to these camps that basically taught them how to not be a combatant anymore and how to, kind of live a normal life and how to do all these things. And I'm wondering if Ukraine is going to have to, function as the same before you leave your military service, if you're going to have to, go through these de-escalation and decombatant courses. But I don't know if there's a plan in place. But if there's not, and if it's not and if there is a plan and it's not executed properly, I think Ukraine is in for a very violent era, even within itself. I think a lot
Yeah.
of men are going to be angry. They're going to be angry with how the war went, and they're going to potentially find blame in each other.
Yeah, I
Um,
mean, because that's an issue, right? Who went and who didn't go?
yes, that's going to be another big one. And
Yeah.
the Southern Command failed in the very early days. And, people are going to start to blame each other for, you know, even within combatants, if all the men serve, people are going to start to blame each other for certain failures. Um, and they're going to start to, how to prevent the next war and what political decisions need to be made to prevent the next war is not just going to be, an election, but it could become violent very quickly. Um, I've been saying it since the beginning. If Ukraine is not careful, it could find itself um, even in the midst of a small civil conflict.
Wow. Yeah. Yeah, and certainly corruption can't happen again. And I mean, it's got to be a whole cleaning out, right?
Yeah. Oh, it looks like Linda Z raised her hand.
Yeah, let's see. Okay, Linda. Linda, look, put your question in the chat room and we'll ask it. We'll make sure we get to it. Let's see. But continue,
But
Matt.
yeah, I'm happy to answer any questions. Yeah. And then, like this, these guys are very, joking around, but also how do you go back to normal life after this? How do you do it? But this was one of the cooler, the more fun shots uh, that I found during that training day. I finally, I caught the mortar in the air as it was flying, and all these guys are laughing and joking and showing me videos about how horrible the front line has been lately. But um, I think, yeah, I think that Ukraine is gonna have a reckoning soon. And I saw one of the questions had to do with
Wait a minute.
in the chat was with women in combat.
Yeah.
Um, and I think there's a very good um, there's a very good documentary called The Invisible Battalion, I believe it was, that discussed women's roles since 2014. So I did an article on it myself about how women in the military has changed a lot. In 2014 and up until I believe it was 2018, women were only allowed to serve as nurses, cooks, cleaners, or like administration. So they weren't allowed in any sort of combatant role. And they personally, these women in the Invisible Battalion went through, volunteer brigades, or they would continue their role as, the cook. But sorry about that. So yeah, oh, we're talking about women in combat.
Right.
And there's a great documentary, and I talked with some of these women for an article that I did called The Invisible Battalion, and how they would go around the rules to fight in combat roles, how they felt that that was their their proper job, that that's what they wanted to do. And by doing so they, unfortunately, when they were injured or killed, they were not given, they were told you were outside of your duties, so we're not going to be able to pay for your rehabilitation, or, they wouldn't be given combat pay. So they would go around these rules at great risk to themselves and at great risk to them, you know, just even financially. They didn't get paid as much and they took the same risks on. And if they got injured, all of the recovery was on them. So finally, Ukraine has changed the rules and are allowing women in combat roles. But you know, it's not a lot of people, it's not a lot of women um, who are in infantry units. I think, you know, in the earlier days there was a lot more just due to the ability to rotate, but you know, I think there's the possibility that you're not going to be able to shower for 3, 4 weeks. And for women, that's kind of a different, you know, a little bit of a health problem. But women are filling combat roles. We just lost a young woman, Margarita, with the third. She was an artist, and you know she was serving in combat roles and medic roles. So there are a lot of women who have joined up and who continue to fight and you know serve, but it just unfortunately um, it is kind of dominated. Well, not unfortunately, you know, Ukraine has a very traditional view of the way that families are done, and a lot of men don't want their wives to go to war. A lot of men don't want the women that they love to go to war, and that's completely understandable. And but fortunately, women who feel like it is their right and it is their duty and it is their desire to go are now being let in. Um, you know, it's understandable not to want women or anyone to go to war, but it is changing for the better for letting women take part in this. And you know, a lot of the best medics and a lot of the best drone operators are becoming women, and you know, the women are slowly but surely fitting into these roles better than they had before, which is quite nice. Nice to see, but again, it is still a very male dominated industry. Um, and then let's see. And you know, we can here's when I was talking about, you know, where we're waiting for drones to pass by. A lot of it is just kind of hanging out and killing time. You know, this was with the that artillery unit where the with the netting and the multiple different colored lights were, and we just kind of sat in this yard while the soldier played with his dog for close to an hour, hour and a half, waiting for the drones to clear. And it was just kind of, you know, it's nice and fun, and then you just kind of get on with your day, but it's, you know, you can see the netting on the ground where the dog is. It's everywhere. And they even have, you know, they carry it in the back of their trucks. That way, when they, you know, they go places, they start putting it over their vehicles or, and not over their vehicles, but where they know they park their vehicles, they can just have it ready to like roll off and protect the vehicle. So the netting has become quite um, an important part of it, but it is just everywhere. It's
And Madeline, there's no reconnaissance or there's no command center to say that we have drones in this area, you know, from a Ukrainian side. We have drones in this area. These, you know, don't worry about those. Is there any of that?
there is, but it's kind of hard. So I think, you know, there's also volunteer units. So you can keep track. So there are these command centers and they have screens and they keep track of, you know, their unit and their battalion's drones. But outside of that, it's kind of hard to figure it out entirely because
Yeah.
it is just the front line is so large that it, you know, at some point, you know, some other random drone is gonna wander past you and it will be your drone. I was with an FPV unit and an FPV drone landed like right outside of the thing, and everyone
Mm.
was panicked because they're like, "Oh God, they found us! They found us! They found us!" And you know, after 20 minutes of them shooting at the drone, trying to get it to explode, um, they finally were able to like, you know, get it apart and not explosive. And it turns out it was a Ukrainian drone that no one knew had launched that command didn't realize was in the air. So even, you know, for the people who have these screens and can see where the drones are and
Mm.
can keep track of them, they just don't know. And you know, these drones can now travel 5, 10 kilometers So
Well,
it's, if they just decide to go a little bit more sideways than normal, it's harder for them to kind of keep track of who is who. Because no one really knows. Um, but and then there's the other end of it where coming off the line sometimes, results in being, grievously injured. This poor guy had was shot through the ankle and developed compartment syndrome. So they had to do a surgery and a stabilization point. And stabilization points there's kind of these chunks of medical care that you receive. So you get the initial medical care where you have a tourniquet put on and you wait for evacuation. And then CASEVAC, so casualty evacuation. And then CASEVAC will come, they'll pick you up, and they'll take you to a medevac point. And then medevac is where, so in CASEVAC, it's just two guys who drive you very, very quickly away from the front line to get you to medevac. And then at medevac, that's where you begin to receive medical treatment. So those are paramedics, EMTs. Some units have doctors on them, but those are the ones where you get your first initial care. And then you go to stabilization points, which is where this is. And stabilization points are essentially emergency hospitals set up in anything from basements to houses to community centers. Rarely they'll use actual hospitals. It's not really that common just because everyone knows where the hospital is. So why would you put a hospital there if it's easy to bomb? So they do these makeshift surgery units in random places. And this was again one of those random places where they just had to kind of build a surgery unit and where they could do very complex, very dangerous surgery on these injured men. And sorry, I should have given a warning on the graphic nature of this one, but this is, what they're doing. This is the inside of this man's leg that they're trying to save. Because the compartments, like, he couldn't wait to go to another hospital. So he went from, being stable and alive and everything, but he could have lost his entire leg based on how this was going. So instead of waiting to move him to a position even further back from the front line to a real hospital, they just did the surgery there, and they're kind of making miracles happen with very little ability and capability that they should have otherwise. But this was, multi-hour long surgery that just took place in a makeshift hospital. Um, and some of these people are medics or medical students who are using this as their beginning of training, as their beginning of their medical career, and they get to see kind of all of this. And sometimes it's small things. This was a man named Zhenya, and he had a really interesting story. He was working with a unit in Kyiv, and he'd been in Kyiv for the past 2 years. And one day they were told that they were going to go to training, and then within a few days, turns out they were getting sent to Borova, to the Borova region. And so he went from, very quickly being in a safe job to being sent to the front line. And, I believe it was his birthday or the day before his birthday, he was injured. And some of that injury came from the explosion with his eye, which is what they were washing out there for him. Um, and you can kind of see in the back how the hospital is boarded up with the stabilization point. Um, the makeshift hospital is boarded up with plywood and all these little holes, and they found a building and they turned it into a hospital. And they're moving them pretty consistently. Out where it is. Once it's found out where it is, that's when Russians will start to target the area, and they will pretty quickly move out of the way. Um, but luckily, this man was fine. He had a few extra holes in him that he didn't have before, just some small shrapnel wounds. but that is a lot of what, people receive, or small shrapnel wounds, or concussions. This young man actually had a very lucky case. He had a piece of shrapnel in his head, so it like got stuck underneath the skin, but didn't go through the skull. So he basically just had a small flesh wound that should have been a lot more deadly. But as you can see, like in this hospital stab point, they even are able to bring in like portable X-ray machines and do the best care that they can. Because this is, the moment for a lot of people where it is life or death, is if they can get to the stabilization points in time, and what type of care they can get at the stabilization points. And
And
not always,
this
oh,
gentleman on the left is just reading a book.
yes, he was just reading a book. There wasn't enough patience for everyone to worry, so he was just having, he was relaxing, taking his time. The old adage, never stand when you can sit. I think that's a good,
Good adage. Yeah.
yeah,
And
it's a
Madeline,
good one.
through this collection, how much time does this represent for you?
Um, these hospital images were all over the course of a night. So
One
the
night,
stat
okay.
stat point, it was over a night. But I think these are all. I'm trying to think. I tried to set it all up in the most recent months. So from November to now, I tried to keep, except for Chernobyl. Chernobyl was in September, but I try to keep it very,
So
the
the past
most
six
recent
months or so.
images. Yeah, the more recent ones, because I think it's changed. The war has completely changed. Um, even the soldiers are joking about how they miss the good old days of the early war. Because it was a different war. It was a different beast, but it was a more understandable beast because they were working with, artillery, and the world has been understanding artillery for almost 100 years now, since World War One. But now with the changing technology, it's gotten hard to keep up and hard to understand, and it's more confusing than it has been before. And as I was saying before, there's no equal, there's no stabilization point is equal, no unit is equal. It's all made up of these kind of pieces that you can get and you can put together, because as much as Ukraine is holding off the Russian army, a lot of it is, it's hard. They're missing critical pieces of equipment. They're missing things that, would never happen in the US military, or in a Western NATO military. They're kind of, they're a lot more chaotic, which benefits them in some ways, but also doesn't benefit them in others. This is one of the nicer stabilization points I've been to. And I've been to ones where it's a hole in the ground and they have one bed, and they're just hoping that they don't have more than one critical patient at a time, because then they have to choose. Um, and eventually this stabilization point has moved, and it's all very chaotic and very unequal, amongst even just soldiers themselves. You can tell in some of the training images who, the gear, they're given standard gear, but the standard gear, from my understanding, is not the best gear. They told me it kind of sucks. The boots aren't that great. They're not waterproof. The clothing isn't always, they don't always have the right size clothing, the right size armor. So a lot of these men are forced to, not forced, but choose to upgrade their own equipment on their own dime. So they pay for their own equipment, they pay for their own stuff, they pay for their own helmets. That way they have a better helmet. And unfortunately, with inequality in Ukraine and inequality in the world, that means that people who had better jobs before the war are more likely to survive the war. I had a friend who had a grenade dropped on him from above, and it bounced off of his helmet, failed to detonate, and like half exploded at his feet. It was a dud. But his greatest complaint was that the medics cut off his boots, pants, and didn't keep his helmet because those were expensive, and now he had to go buy new ones. Um, and that was his thing. He was like, "I was a very good helmet," and they wouldn't let him, like they threw it away like it meant nothing. And they were mad that they that he had to go and buy a new helmet because it is a lot of this is self-funded, and you can see it in units having to fundraise for vehicles and having to fundraise for drones and having to pay for it themselves just to be able to do the work that they do, which again, I could never even imagine the US military having anyone pay for their own equipment like this. Um, and then, there's just a lot of small injuries. This guy was very nice. He got hit with shrapnel in the butt. So they started calling them buttholes because they got extra holes in the butt. Um, but in this makeshift operating room, they were able to, remove the shrapnel that they could from him right there. From the third point of contact from his evacuation, they were able to get it out instead of having to send him to Dnipro or Lviv. So they've been able to do this medicine that is, helping prevent necrosis, helping prevent longer term muscle and nerve damage, helping them heal up faster. So that way, unfortunately, they can return to the line, but they just have to do it there, and sometimes that means less painkillers than people would like, but they're able to just kind of fix and patch up as needed instead of having to, really rely on large scale large scale hospitals in the west of Ukraine, which are being completely overrun. They're entirely filled. Um, and this gentleman also had some shrapnel, but he came in with a monkey. He brought in his stuffed monkey with him, which was very funny. Part of his shoulder was dislocated, so they had to like pop it back in. But the entire time he refused to let go of the stuffed monkey. He was absolutely not having it. And I was wondering, I was like, I was so sad. I was like, is it his son's monkey? Is it his kids? Did, someone important give it to him? And finally we asked him, and it turns out the medics that picked him up, they've seen him like 4 or 5 times at this point because he keeps going back to the line and keeps getting injured. And it's the same medics who take him from the line to the hospital. So every time now they just give him a toy. So for whatever reason, this 26-year-old man just keeps getting toys from these medics. And he was given enough painkillers that he was not letting go of that monkey. And I was so sad. I was like on the verge of tears, just thinking, oh, his son gave it to him. This is the saddest thing I've ever seen. And no, it turns out the medics gave him a monkey, and he just really enjoyed holding on to this monkey. Um,
Maddie, if you made that story up, no one would really believe it.
yeah, no one would. It was so, and I was so
Uh,
distraught because I was like, how am I? And there's a part of me that's like, this is perfect. These photos, this man's going to tell me it's his kid's monkey. It's going to be this great thing. I'm going to have this cute little story with it. And no, he's not married. He doesn't have any kids. He just really liked the toy. And that was it. There's no greater meaning behind it, which I think
are you
is
sorry you asked him?
no, because I think it would have been worse living with like how sad it was than with the reality of it being kind of dumb.
Okay.
But I kind of like it. I like that it's a little, stupid toy that this man attached to after being injured. I think it's funnier that way because,
Yeah.
he's still a kid himself. He's in his 20s, and he's might be covered in tattoos and scars and has been on the front line for years, but he still really enjoys having a stuffed animal. I think it gives a great sense of humanity to soldiers, that they're not even the ones who are like him who volunteered very, very early on, I think pre-invasion, if I recall correctly. And has been fighting and has been very, gung ho and really ready to engage in combat his entire time from speaking with him. He's still just a kid. He still just likes a monkey. He still enjoys these small little things. And I think, you know, he could be 50 or he could be 18, but there's still just something that like Ukrainians are going to have to suffer through a lot, but at least they won't have to fully suffer. There's still large pieces of them that are going to be intact, like this, and that can be
Yeah,
rebuilt off of small little silly toy monkeys.
good.
And then there's this is the city of Barova, and the only reason I actually included this was this was a cultural center that was in Barova, and we hiked to the top of it. It was destroyed during the Kharkiv counteroffensive. Then, the building's partially destroyed. The first floors collapsed, as you can see. And it was, where the theater was, a lot of school and education centers were, and a lot of these, beautiful, beautiful places were. And unfortunately, today it was completely leveled. The Russians had hit it again, and they were targeting something in the area. I'm not entirely sure what, but even the fully destroyed buildings are now just being reduced to absolutely nothing. Instead of a shell, it just becomes a pile of rubble. Um, and so luckily no one was actually based in this building, but I wanted to include it because it is an example of the fact that it is, it's still ongoing and they're still hitting things that are destroyed. For whatever reason, whether they missed or whether they thought that there was something in that building, they decided to hit it again and completely destroy it. Um, but and then yeah, this is my last slide. I thought it'd be fun to leave with the sweet old man waving off, and it's also another clear example of what I mean by no nobody is like equal in their equipment at all. You can kind of tell the difference between the armor on the left side versus the armor the other guys are wearing, the hats, the helmets. It's all what they can find, what they can afford. Like even the knee pads, the two knee pads on the right are two very different styles and very different kind of costings versus the man who's waving who doesn't have knee pads at all. Um, so they kind of are all just kind of making do with what they have, and they're doing a great job so far. But the great fear now is what's going to happen with the West and the United States. Um, yeah, I
Wow.
think that
That's
is.
Maddie, thank you so much for doing that. That's really a terrific presentation. You always bring a sensitivity to your presentation. Now this is your second time with us, and bring out the normalcy of what's going on in a crazy war.
Yeah, yeah. I think that's part of it. It's for me personally, I find it very easy to be sensitive, when a playground is bombed and when the children's hospital is bombed. I live, few hundred meters from the children's hospital, and it's very easy and understanding of like how horrific it is, but I think that there is a missing piece when it comes to soldiers and when it comes to the people fighting the war, that you know they become numbers very quickly, and in the history books they become numbers very quickly. And I think that there's just something important about even just having a photo of an old man waving at you before he goes to infantry, because these men are going to be on the front lines. They're the ones that are assaulting trenches, that are getting their trenches assaulted. Um, like it's harder to imagine without a picture of them what exactly that means. But this man who is, I would say, at the earliest 55 is an infantry soldier.
Go figure. Well, unbelievable.
Yeah. So, and I don't know where these men are, unfortunately, but more often than not, you don't get good news after working with most of these men. And I joke, I think I have three friends that are alive since 2022. Um, Only three of them have made it through at this point. Um, and it's just the numbers are dwindling. A lot of the people in these photos I know have already, been killed in action or are missing in action, which is essentially the same thing. They just can't recover the bodies. So I think it's important to remember that these are people too.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. So you could stop sharing. And Manny, so you're gonna head back later this week.
Yep, so I leave tomorrow. So I'm taking a train in about 27 hours back east.
Okay. If anyone has any questions, you can put it in the chat room or raise your hand. Um, so, and I know it's in the middle of the night for you, Maddie. So, again, I thank you, and I know that you just got back from Sierra Leone, and eventually we'll do a story on that. Whenever you're ready.
Yeah, I would love to. Sierra Leone, I think, is a very different story. And it's a very interesting place, but it was a nice break from the Ukrainian winter to go to the tropics. Uh, Coming back was a rougher transition than I thought it was going to be. It's very cold here.
Yeah.
But everyone in Kyiv is telling me how wonderful and warm it's become. So,
Okay. It's around the corner. Spring is around the corner.
oh, thank God. I cannot do this winter anymore. It is brutal.
Yeah. Well, Maddie, I thank you very much. Again, we all really, really appreciate what you're doing and keeping us informed. And, the platform is always here for you. And, whenever you're ready, just, reach back to me and, we'll make it happen. And most importantly, be careful. Your grandmother will not forgive you if you get hurt. You know that.
No, she won't. I already told my friend who's my emergency contact, if the only reason to call my grandmother if I'm hurt is if I'm unconscious. Other than that, don't tell her.
Okay.
She'll find out at another time.
Okay. Great. And give kisses to Svet for us.
Of course, I'll tell her everyone says hello, but thank you guys for having me. I apologize I'm leaving so early, but it is about 3 in the morning, so I'm gonna go straight to bed.
Great.
Apology not needed.
Thank you very, very much, Maddie. We'll be in
Thank you
touch.
guys. Have a good night.
You too,
Good
hon.
night.
Thank you.